working to connect a region of over 600 million bridges between our lands.
Welcome to ASEAN in Focus. I'm Dr. Kaloy Tabunda, Executive Director of the Asian Studies Center of the New Year University. Today we are honored to have as guest Dr. Jorge Tigno, Professor of the University of the Philippines, Political Science Department. We'll discuss first before our discussion on the book, on your chapter on the book on the ASEAN drama. We'll first discuss one of the still burning issues of the day, the Marawi crisis, which comes, it's more than a month already right now, yeah. And it comes within the first year of the President Duterte administration. How do you describe the Marawi crisis?
Well, for one, this is kind of a strange way to end your first year as president. No? It's not really a kind of good legacy to leave behind in your first year. For another, I think it's important for the president to realize that there is still this problem in Mindanao that needs to be resolved. Not so much in a military sense, but more in terms of providing a political solution that is long-term.
Okay. One of your fields of expertise, I understand, is local governments. How do you see, how should the local government have acted, to prevent what's happening in Marawi right now?
Yes. Well, of course, it's difficult to give these impressions in hindsight. No? In some ways, it might not be that fair, but at the same time, it's also important to learn from this experience, especially on the part of the local governments. I understand that the national government is putting in place some funds for the rehabilitation of the city of Marawi, although I would say that also it's not only the city of Marawi that needs rehabilitation, the city itself, but perhaps even the surrounding areas, because you have to provide for the livelihoods of people. And this is where the local government can play a significant role, a big role in terms of coordinating these relief efforts and also sustaining the livelihoods of people, and finally also to reassure the people that it is really safe to return.
Forgive me for going back to the previous question. How could the local government have prevented? Because do you believe in the impression that this is a failure of intelligence, or do you believe that at least somehow the local government knew what was going on before this happened?
Okay, good question. Because the intelligence that the government receives, especially the military and the police, relies a great deal on the information provided by the people, by the citizens, by the local communities. And this is where local governments can come into play. I would imagine that, arming a large band of men, arming them, bringing in supplies into the city of Marawi would be noticeable, especially to local officials, if not to ordinary citizens. But I'm surprised that there seems to be very little intelligence that's been used, if any kind of intelligence was ever gathered prior to the incursions in Marawi.
But the local governments can actually help in intelligence gathering. Is it allowed by the by statutes, by law?
Yes, they can coordinate. They have to coordinate for peace and order efforts, maintaining security for the inhabitants of the communities. And the good thing about the local governments is that they have extensions of their presence in the barangays, in the puroks, and so these local leaders, grassroots leaders, can actually provide that kind of information. I'm just curious, or in fact surprised, that no such intelligence was given, or if there were such intelligence information given that it was not utilized to prevent this kind of incident from taking place.
Okay, so they said that this will be over in a few days, although they said a month ago that this will be over shortly.
That was yes.
But so we're now talking about the rehabilitation phase, the rehabilitation portion. You were saying that the local government should take a more active role. How do you view this more active role by the local government?
Okay. Well, first of all, let me go back to my very first point about this being a strange way to end your first year.
Yes, yes.
Because in my own personal sense, Marawi is the Philippines' 9/11. It's a tragedy, a major tragedy.
A defining
that could
moment.
have been prevented.
Yeah. Yes, yes.
And it now defines the first year of our president, which I think is, well, to me, it's a sad way to define your moment.
Yes.
It's like, you know, when you know that a room in your house has faulty wiring and you did not do anything about it, and you let the room burn, and then you put it out and say, oh, look, I'm successful in putting out the fire. You see?
Okay. Okay, we shift to the next question. Okay. So how should the local government be now involved in the rehabilitation efforts?
In the rehabilitation efforts, well, the local governments can actually provide the information in terms of which resources are needed for what areas and what members of the community would need what.
Okay.
Because the local governments would be in a better position to know, you know, what the situation is, and they can be in a better position to gather that kind of information.
Specifically, this is part of Mindanao, and this will be part of the proposed Bangsamoro autonomous state, whatever it is. Okay, so they would be more. They should be more sensitive to what the local government people would be saying. So it should not be the national government that should be dictating what has to be done. So, and then what do you foresee as the role of other sectors in rebuilding Marawi?
Well, in terms of the way I see it, in terms of the role of business,
especially business,
the business community. But I think the way that the business community can be encouraged to go back or to do more business in Marawi is by giving out that sense, no, that things are now secure. They're not back to normal. I don't think the situation will ever get back to the pre-conflict situation, but at least there is some degree of stability, of predictability, and that you can, I mean, the local government has to give that kind of assurance that it is all right to do business and to operate in Marawi.
And we hope and pray that this problem will be over soon, and so the people of Marawi, the local government of Marawi, and all the other sectors there can start to rebuild so that once more life will go back to normal.
Yes.
Welcome to ASEAN in Focus Weekend Edition. We continue our interview with Dr. Jorge Tigno, the professor of the University of the Philippines Political Science Department and a co-author of our book, The ASEAN Drama, Half a Century and Still Unfolding. Earlier, we started talking about the assessing about the first year of the Duterte administration, and you mentioned that the Marawi crisis serves as the 9/11 moment of this administration. What else can you say about this administration?
Well, usually it's the last impression that will last for a president. No? And although President Duterte has done a lot, has accomplished a lot, we tend to remember the very recent, the most recent incident under his administration. And this is what what has happened, in the case of Marawi, this is now remembered as the final point in the first year of the president. And I earlier described it as the Philippines 9/11 because of the magnitude of the tragedy, and that this can also lead to, well, I'm hoping it does not get worse, but this certainly has opened up the country to terrorist groups coming from, especially overseas, but also from different segments of our society.
A few weeks back, one of your colleagues at the Political Science Department, Professor Herman Kraft, was a guest here, and we tried to make a differentiation. We tried to compare the different terrorist, the secessionist movements in Mindanao. You have the MNLF under Nur Miswari, which was supposed to establish a secular state, and then the MILF, whose aim was to establish an Islamic state. And then we have these extremists now. We have the Abu Sayyaf group, and now we have these ISIS-inspired groups, which, according to him, are not after the establishment of any secular or Islamic state in the Philippines, but an establishment of an extension of a caliphate coming from, from the Middle East. What can you say about this?
Well, definitely the kind of armed groups that we now face in Mindanao are different from the groups that we used to face. It was before simply a matter of giving recognition, giving some kind of identity to groups in Mindanao. Now it's something else. Definitely, it's moved on, and it's become more and more radical, more and more violent, to the point that you don't see anymore any kind of sense in it. It loses all coherence and logic. And this is the particular kind of terrorist or armed action that is very difficult to anticipate.
So how should the government react to this now?
Okay. The immediate solution, of course, would be one that's military, but I don't think that the military solution would be sufficient. A military response is only good in the immediate sense, in the short term, but over the long term it has to be a political solution, and also the effective use of intelligence, because without intelligence, it's really difficult to anticipate the moves that these kinds of groups will make.
So do you see this playing out over a long time, and it will help define this Duterte administration, apart, of course, from the actions against the drugs problem?
Yeah. Well, like I said, this is our 9/11, and what happened in the U.S. when they experienced 9/11 was that it was a turning point for them. And I would say that the same thing is the case for the Philippines. It's now a turning point in terms of how we deal with the problems of our society and of our state. The usual responses may not be enough. There is a need
this
for...
This is more than military response.
No, I don't think a military solution would be enough to address this problem. What you need is a new kind of solution that is more on the diplomatic and political side. I'm not saying that we should accept this kind of incursions that are happening to us. There should be opposition to it, but at the same time we should work towards preventing these terrorist groups from having this kind of fertile soil that they can cultivate their networks in. Yeah.
So what are the more long-term solutions you're proposing?
Well, as I see it, the solution is, I said, political, and so part of that would have to deal with instituting political measures that would grant a degree of recognition to the southern part of the Philippines, the people in Mindanao, and also to provide them with a sense that, you know, there has to be some stability, some predictability in order for businesses to thrive, for people to settle there, and for young people to feel comfortable in such a way that they do not feel oppressed or insecure, or that they are not living in fear.
Okay, you spoke of a political solution. Are you referring to federalism?
Okay.
Or is it
yes.
one of the solutions?
I thought you were going to bring that up. Well, the way I see it, the local government code already provides the conditions for decentralized government, short of calling it a federal state,
so,
a federal system.
So you're saying that we really don't need to federalize?
I mean, simply declaring a federal system is superfluous. You look at the local government code and put that into serious effect. I mean, for one, you have in the local government code a provision that says that Congress has to review the code and its implementation every 5 years.
And we haven't done any serious review.
Has been there for more than 2 decades now.
1992, yes.
1991.
1991, okay.
More than 2 decades. Not a single review has taken place.
So can we not compel Congress to do that? I mean, that's supposed to be in the law. Who should compel Congress to, hey, it says here every 5 years you should review, but they're not doing that.
Okay. Well, a playful lawyer would have filed a case, you know, for culpable violation, but would you file a case? It's not just one Congress that did it.
Okay.
It's all the succeeding Congresses. And so you have a problem where you don't know what the problem is, but you're providing a solution already, which is federalism. How can that be?
Okay. So what else in the local government code that does not warrant, you know, shifting to federalism, especially in Mindanao?
Okay. The local governments are actually, I mean, we tend to think that they don't have power, that it's all controlled by Imperial Manila and all of that. But if you look at the local government code, the provisions of the code provide for capacities, for functions to be undertaken at the local government level by local government units, by local chief executives to, for example, undertake services, even enforce some degree of taxation, of resource generation. And so they have those kinds of powers already in place, which is pretty much what we're asking for, what people who are in favor of federalism are asking for. So we should focus our attention on making sure that the local government code is really put into serious effect, rather than create a new system altogether that, I mean, from a political science standpoint, if you institute a new thing, you should expect, you know, what's this? Unintended consequences.
Yes.
And the bigger the change that you're instituting, the bigger the number of unintended consequences you should prepare for.
Yes, yes.
And so that's even more problematic. Rather than, you know, look at the code, we know its provisions, we've been enforcing it, except that in some cases it's not very seriously enforced. And so you need to just put that into effect and, I mean, see what problems come along. And maybe if there's a need to revise it, provided you review the implementation, then you do so. Rather than propose you scrap the code altogether and propose a new system that you don't know if it's going to work at all, or that if, you know, there are other unintended consequences, like for all we know, it might even empower local warlords. That's precisely the people that you don't want to be empowered.
Yeah, but the ARMM area where Marawi is supposed to be part of has already experienced some sort of, you know, autonomy but it seems that they have not succeeded. So it may be a factor of, are the people or are the leaders ready to, to really take on the, the challenges of real autonomy, short of federalism?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. Because right now, what we know about the problems faced by the ARMM and by local government code are essentially anecdotal. There has not been that kind of systematic study of the performance, the effectiveness of decentralization and its implementation, especially in the ARMM areas or in the areas of Mindanao. And so you have a situation where you have yet to find out what the real problems are, and that you need to, I mean, from an academic standpoint, you have to have studies of this kind.
But who's supposed to be doing those studies?
Yes, it should be, I mean, by the provisions of the local code, it should be Congress that should initiate these reviews every 5 years.
So it appears now that our problem really is those who are supposed to perform their duties, the members of Congress, but they're not doing this. So how should we proceed now?
Well, we should, I mean, if we're really serious about making sure that the people in government will do their jobs, we should let them know that they need to do this, that this is the way to do their jobs, and that we should write our congressmen, I guess, and tell them that they need to do these reviews. Although we in the academic community have been voicing this out for so long already, but they don't seem to, we don't seem to get a response from people in Congress.
Okay, but still there's this recurring issue that the leaders of those places in the country, of those regions, are not really prepared to handle the cudgels of real autonomy. So do you believe in this observation?
Well, my suspicion is that the people who are in these areas on the ground are the ones benefiting from precisely this kind of problems, these challenges, of patronage and all of that. And so, I mean, if they're benefiting from it, why should they be expected to review it and to change it eventually? I mean, it's hard to convince somebody.
Yeah, but there's this urgency. I mean, if we're not really, okay, you said we don't really need federalism, but we have to, these people here have to shape up. So.
Yes, and this is where I think the opposition, I guess, to federalism is coming from. That you need to have an honest-to-goodness assessment first of what's wrong with the political system of the country, and you come up with appropriate solutions, appropriate measures to it. You don't just say, we need federalism because, period. So it's not going to solve anything. If anything, it's actually even going to create even more problems for the country.
Okay. When we come back, we will talk now about your chapter in the ASEAN drama, Half a Century and Still Unfolding. ASEAN in Focus Weekend. We'll be back. Welcome back to ASEAN in Focus Weekend Edition. We'll stay here with Dr. Jorge Tigno, Professor of the University of the Philippines Political Science Department and one of the chapter authors of this book, The ASEAN Drama, Half a Century and Still Unfolding. Your chapter is entitled Down the Rocky Road to Building ASEAN Identity and Citizenship, and you started your chapter with a discussion of the three pillars of the ASEAN community. You have the economic pillar, political security, and the socio-cultural pillar, which you said is the least developed among the three pillars. Why?
Okay. Well, the observation that I make in the chapter that the socio-cultural pillar is the weakest is based on the very nature of ASEAN itself as an intergovernmental organization. It started out as an intergovernmental organization. It is still an intergovernmental organization. In other words, it's composed of the leaders of these states that comprise the association. And so if you look at the that kind of nature of ASEAN and juxtapose it with the social-cultural, it seems, to me at least, it seems out of place. Because you're talking about the peoples of ASEAN, the communities, the societies of ASEAN that need now to be integrated or molded into one ASEAN identity, which I find off the character of the original character at least of ASEAN.
How do you find ASEAN identity then? Is there an ASEAN identity, or are we going to that? And if you're going to that, what should be, how should it be when we're there?
Recently, there was a memo, I think, to all government agencies for them to display the ASEAN flag or something, or to sing the hymn, ASEAN hymn, or to wear an ASEAN, whatever that is, you know, whatever the ASEAN attire, you know. And so this, I think, is an artificial, not a very good start for ASEAN. That is not to say, however, that ASEAN has not accomplished anything. It has accomplished a lot over the last several decades, half a century already. It has accomplished a lot. But in the area of socio-cultural integration, I think that is its weakest point, and that we need to focus our attention into reviewing this kind of an orientation for ASEAN as a socio-cultural community.
But do you think it is possible to achieve a quote-unquote common identity for ASEAN? Or what are the factors that are there that could lead to, you know, developing this identity?
I mean, it's interesting because in other countries like the EU right now, they're actually grappling with their own identity as the European Union, especially after Brexit. You have the same situation unfolding in some ways in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, where you have these three countries going against one country, Qatar.
It's now 7. It's now 7 countries against Qatar.
It's now 7 countries. But of the GCC members, there are 3, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And so you have this kind of unraveling of these kinds of organizations. What is also good to hear about ASEAN is that we're not faced with this kind of, we're not seeing Indonesia, for example, demanding to the Philippines that you so and so. No? So in a way, we are better off because we do things very slowly. So you might say that the disadvantage of ASEAN, the doing it by consensus and moving slowly,
the ASEAN way, which is
the ASEAN way, is also an advantage for ASEAN.
So it takes more time for us to really fuse together, if we are going to fuse together in the near or in the far future.
Well, personally, I'm not really impatient, you know, about ASEAN eventually coming together, you know, this ASEAN, so-called ASEAN identity coming together. Or what frustrates me is the way that the leaders of ASEAN seem to have the impression that we are on that way, that we are actually entering that stage where, I mean, ASEAN, don't they have a sense of what ASEAN means, the history of ASEAN, and to have an identity that is ASEAN? Because it started out as an association of, you might say, dictators, a club of dictators.
Yes, way back in 1967.
When it started out. And so you have, over the decades, a change in the leadership so that eventually you get this new breed of leaders now in ASEAN that think that, oh, maybe this is the way to go. But I find it strange. It's not a country. It's not, you know, a national identity, ASEAN. And if you look at in the chapter, it's discussed there, the extent to which the different countries that comprise ASEAN look upon ASEAN, or the extent to which they feel close to ASEAN.
You're talking about the citizens?
The people of
the
ASEAN.
People themselves,
yes.
okay.
It actually varies from country to country. You can have a country like Vietnam that feels very, very close towards ASEAN.
Identifies closely with ASEAN.
Identifies very well with ASEAN. Or you can have a country like Indonesia that does not identify as much.
Which is quite ironic, because Indonesia is where the ASEAN Secretariat is, and 1/3 of ASEAN in terms of land area is Indonesia. In terms of population, it's also Indonesia. And in terms of economic size, it's also Indonesia.
That's right.
But their identification with ASEAN is lesser compared to, for example, Vietnam and perhaps the other countries. Okay.
And if you look at the extent of the migration flows, movement of people, it's true that you now have more and more tourists, you know, from within ASEAN traveling from other ASEAN countries. But if you look at the other kind of flows that happen, like migration for employment, for settlement, there is still a limited, there's only a limited degree of these flows that are taking place. For example, between Indonesia, and you can speak of corridors of migrant workers coming from Indonesia going to, let's say, Malaysia or Singapore, or the Philippines going to Singapore, or Myanmar going into Thailand, you know. But other than that, there's not much that can be said about these kinds of migrant flows.
But when you say about, isn't migration one of the factors that will help in, you know, establishing the ASEAN identity? Because people from this region, from these countries, will now be more exposed to, you know, the cultures of the other member countries.
Yes, ideally, there has to be this kind of free flow of peoples across the countries of the Southeast Asian sub-region. But again, this is where the states come into play, you know, because it's the states that have the final say as to who gets to enter, who gets to stay, for how long, and for what purpose. And so you don't have the kind of free movement that you would expect to happen. In effect, what's been happening is a movement that is restricted by the countries that receive these migrants or these tourists.
But ideally, these, you know, state barriers should be, you know, should be brought down, should be broken down, and there has to be now freer movement among these peoples of ASEAN, cities, like what we can see in Europe, for example. So, is it possible in the near future that we can achieve this, you know, borderless, you know, movement within ASEAN?
I don't think that's possible within maybe this generation even, or the next generation, because the states are really very protective of their prerogatives, of their territories. I mean, we see that being played out from time to time. In ASEAN, there is supposed to be a declaration on the rights of migrant workers within ASEAN. But up to now, it hasn't been enforced.
Why do you think this is still happening in ASEAN?
Well, mainly it's because of the opposition coming from the receiving countries, in particular Malaysia and Singapore. They're the ones that simply do not accept this kind of integration. When it comes to low-skilled and medium-skilled migrants coming into their countries.
So you're saying, in fact, that actual integration within ASEAN is still a dream at this point.
it's still a long way off.
Still a long way off.
It's still a long way off. We don't even have a framework for it. We haven't, I mean, you can talk about the ASEAN social-cultural blueprint, no? But I think it's too ambiguous at this point to really say how you're going to proceed towards that. And so, I mean, given that kind of very significant absence of a framework, a concrete framework, I don't think we are anywhere close to coming up with an integrated ASEAN identity.
Who should be, I mean, who should be taking the lead in crafting that framework? Or is there a possibility that somebody would take the lead? You said that because of this resistance from Singapore and Malaysia, so there's this. This is what prevents, you know, the freer flow of ASEAN citizens from one country to another. Is there somebody? Is there a nation? Is there a country, a member state who can take the lead in this area?
The main problem is in the way ASEAN itself is organized. The system within ASEAN constrains it from acting in a way that looks beyond their respective states.
Okay. Because of the ASEAN way, at least when these two countries oppose it, so nothing will happen.
Yes.
But we're globalizing.
Well, they interpret consensus. Consensus is different from, for example, exercising your right to veto something.
There's no veto.
Well, that's precisely the problem. There is, I mean, that's the only thing, that's the only way that ASEAN is making these decisions. As long as no one vetoes, then it's good to go. But the moment one country, even one country vetoes it, that whole thing falls apart.
But as a whole, can you see this migration? Actually, migration now is more active than it was before.
Yes.
But can you see that migration will bring about, you know, developing this ASEAN identity?
Eventually, I think. I don't think we should force ASEAN, the 10 countries, to have a common identity right away, especially if the initiative is coming from the states themselves.
Okay.
Because within ASEAN, I mean, knowing the history of the peoples and the countries of ASEAN, there's always a tendency to look upon, on the part of the peoples of ASEAN, to look upon their respective states with some degree of suspicion. And so if it's designed, if ASEAN identity, you know, this framework is designed by states, then there is a tendency for the peoples of ASEAN to look upon it with some degree of suspicion, of hesitation. Why should we come in and legitimize these states that are oppressing us, violating our rights, and so on?
Okay, when we come back, we'll talk more about the building of the ASEAN identity and the challenges of the times. ASEAN in Focus, we'll be right back. Okay, we're back with our last portion of interview with Dr. Jorge Tigno, the professor of the University of the Philippines Political Science Department. We started talking about the factors that will bring about building the ASEAN identity. And in your chapter, you mentioned 4 values: tolerance attached to foreigners, political attitudes, and of course, one of the most important actually is citizen awareness. So we begin with values. What are the values attached to this one?
To a great extent, there are some commonalities in terms of the social values of people in Southeast Asia. Many of them respect their elders. Many of them have a great deal of respect for religion and religious affiliations. There is some degree of respect for sexual identity and gender, but I don't see that as a major issue or a major divisive issue for the people of ASEAN. So in effect, the values of ASEAN are pretty much almost on the same page, as it were, not on the same level, but there are still nuances, but that can be a starting point for a collective sense of identification.
In the earlier parts of your chapter, you mentioned two figures who are considered as ASEAN figures. You have Jose Rizal and Chulalongkorn.
Yes,
King Chulalongkorn.
King Chulalongkorn.
Okay, so maybe we could develop some more, figures which can be identified as ASEAN by the 10 member states, by the citizens of the 10 member states. Okay, so one is value. The next is tolerance attached to foreigners. How important is this?
Well, it's important because it can also play a role in terms of the free movement of people across borders in ASEAN. And so if you have, for example, indifference or at least animosity towards a certain group, that can be a challenge for integrating the identities of ASEAN.
Actually, this is a challenge now because when we talk of the Marawi crisis, they identified non-Filipino fighters among the terrorists there. So this could be quite a challenge. Okay,
yes.
so this would result to lesser tolerance for for foreigners.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
The third one is political attitudes. What's in here?
Well, that has to do with the democratic values of the peoples of ASEAN, and to a great extent, a lot of the citizens of ASEAN feel very strongly towards towards democracy and democratic way of life. And so again, that can be a starting point.
Yeah, but there are some countries which are autocratic. Not all countries in ASEAN are democratic.
That's right.
We still have a constitutional monarchy.
Yes.
We still have a communist, at least we have 2 communist states, I think. And then we have, at least Myanmar is slowly democratizing. So do you see a trend towards more democratic space in the region?
Well, there seems to be. That seems to be an indication that even the non-democratic states in ASEAN are starting to initiate steps towards opening their governments to criticism or to opposition groups. You look at, for example, in Myanmar, in Cambodia, in Vietnam, and so there is that kind of direction that the governments of ASEAN seem to be taking. So it's also another way. But what I might consider to be a challenge is, I mean, it's one thing if the governments think that this is the road towards democracy. It's another thing if the people say that's not the road towards democracy.
So the two views has to be reconciled.
Yeah.
Okay. And the last factor you mentioned, which I think is really very important, is citizen awareness. How is the awareness of citizen on the ASEAN?
Of ASEAN.
Of ASEAN.
Well,
not even identity, but of ASEAN as a as an entity.
Popularity of ASEAN varies from country to country. You can have a country where the newspapers would report events that happen in the ASEAN, among the ASEAN countries. You would have countries that would have so-called ASEAN lanes at immigration, at the airports. But in other countries, there's no such special treatment for so-called ASEAN nationals, or there is no reporting at all about the events that are happening in ASEAN. And so you have these kinds of differences. And this is, I think, the measure of the extent of integration of ASEAN. If people in the region, you know, the people in the region can't even identify who the 10 members are of ASEAN, then you have a problem.
So who should lead in creating this awareness? Government?
My own sense is that ASEAN really, I mean, in the final analysis, it's a government, you know, led initiative. It's the governments that make it so. And if you really want to integrate the peoples of ASEAN, you have to open up ASEAN more and more to civil society organizations, people's organizations. You let them also take part in the decision-making process, and not just confine everything to a yearly summit of the heads of state, you know, or meetings where you have representatives of the governments of ASEAN only. And so you have to involve more and more of these civil society groups. The problem, however, is that in some of these countries, civil society organizations are actually
they don't have much participation. They're not allowed.
Well, they're not allowed. They are suspects. Their motives are suspect. And so you have a problem.
Okay. How about the academic sector, the education sector?
Yes, that can be a good starting point. You can have exchanges of students. You can have a common curriculum, for example, among the 10 ASEAN countries. So that students can actually study in one university in one country and finish in another university in another country. But that would entail really strong coordination among universities. Well, my own personal view is that you can't have government coming in there because that's going to impact on the motives of these initiatives. So you have to have really strengthening of the universities' capacities to undertake these kinds of exchanges, these kinds of relations, you know, between universities across the region.
Okay, can you comment on the Philippines' activities in creating awareness? Right now we're the host, so.
Yes, the Philippines is the chair
of ASEAN
this year.
Are we doing enough?
Unfortunately, I'm not seeing that much that's being done to create this kind, other than the memo that we all got for government offices that you're supposed to sing
that came from the Civil Service Commission.
Wear the ASEAN costume. Like I said, what's that? What's an ASEAN costume? What's an ASEAN attire?
What's the ASEAN anthem?
What's the ASEAN hymn? What's the ASEAN anthem? We probably know the flag because we see it once in a while, but I don't think that that's the only benchmark for creating an ASEAN identity.
So it's begin with really educating, starting from the young now.
Oh yes, yes. You have to start with the elementary educational system. But you see, this is my problem with my own personal problem, because ASEAN really is a government-led association.
So it has to be translated into the other.
Well, you need to have a separate calling for it. You know, a separate name for it. I don't know what that is. What would it be called? A Malay identity? No, because there are also Chinese and Indians, and you know, so it can't be Malay. But to say that it's a Southeast Asian identity, what's that?
What's that?
What is that?
Okay, so it's really a long way to go to develop this ASEAN identity.
We're different from Europe. Europeans have a sense that they are Europeans, even though they're also Germans and Spaniards and so on, right?
The Arab states have a sense that they're
exactly. Okay. But in our case, what's that?
So you're seeing that
a similar kind of terminology, other than ASEAN. I don't want ASEAN to be part of to have an ASEAN identity. You know.
So finally. what can you say about this, our road, our quest for building this ASEAN identity? Is it possible, or what
Well,
are the challenges that
That's
have to be
why
met?
that explains the title. It's a rocky road. It's not a smooth kind of road where it's really going to happen very quickly, very fast, very smoothly. No, it's going to take place over a long period of time. A lot of struggle has to take place because we really have to find out what
Yes.
it is that we're talking about when we have a common identity.
Yes, yes. We're now 50 years old, and do you think for the next 50 years we'll be able to achieve that identity?
For the next 50 years, I doubt it.
So,
I doubt it.
Okay, so we're still evolving, the ASEAN identity
We are,
is still
yes.
evolving, but hopefully someday we will be a more cohesive region, you know, and serving the interests of, you know, the citizens of the 10 ASEAN members.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. George Tigno.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming, and we hope you will be here in our next episodes.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm Kaloy Tabunda, and I am one with 25.